regrette rien, ni le bien qu'on m'a fait, ni le mal, tout ça m'est bien égal. Non, rien de rien, non, je ne regrette rien, c'est payé.
In 1944, at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 44 nations gathered to design a new system. Their goal is to build a framework for global economic cooperation and prevent a return to the chaos that preceded the war. That vision finally became a reality as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank became fully operational by 1947. For nearly 8 years now, the IMF has published the World Economic Outlook twice a year, a semi-annual survey of global economic conditions, emerging risk, and medium-term prospects. This October 2025 report carries particular urgency. The title speaks volumes: Global Economy in Flux. Prospects remain dim. This report examined three critical dimensions of the contemporary economic landscape. First, it addresses immediate prospects and policy choices amid unprecedented trade policy, uncertainty, and fragmentation. Second, it analyzes why some emerging markets have proven resilient to external shocks, whether through policy reform or fortune. Third, it evaluates industrial policy interventions, the resurgence of government direction in economic activity, and the complex trade-offs they entail.
Tariff of 34%. I think, in other words, they charge us, we charge them less. So how can anybody be upset? They will be, because we never charge anybody anything, but now we're going to charge.
Chapter 1 of the report, Global Prospects and Policies, begins by establishing that the global economy in 2025 is defined by fluidity and volatility. This dynamic is driven by a reordering of policy priorities. A series of new US tariff measures has lifted tariff rates to levels not seen in a century. The report's data, shown in Figure 1.1, US effective tariff rates by country, illustrates this sharp increase. For instance, the effective tariff rate on Chinese goods surged from near zero at the end of 2024 to over 40% by April 2025, before settling lower. Although subsequent trade deals have brought these rates down from their April highs, Figure 1.2 shows that trade policy uncertainty remains exceptionally elevated in an interconnected global economy. As described by researchers like Lanzen, 2012, shocks propagate through complex supply chain, making their final impact difficult to predict. Beyond trade, other policy domains have shifted. Official development assistance dropped by 9% in 2024. With the report, a similar drop is expected in 2025. Simultaneously, several advanced economies have introduced more restrictive stances on immigration, causing net migration inflows to decline sharply. On the domestic side, major economies, most notably the United States, have shifted toward a more stimulative fiscal stance, including changes in defense spending. This has raised concerns about the sustainability of public finances and the potential for broad cross-border spillovers.
In fact, in the early part of 2025, it even increased because there was a lot of front-loading. Businesses were trying to get ahead of tariffs that would be implemented later on, and there was a surge in imports for many countries that boosted overall trade. But our picture, when we look 3-4 years out, we're seeing that that level of trade will actually moderate, and it will change in its composition. We're seeing a lot less trade, for instance, between the US and China. But we're seeing a lot more trade between either US and China and other parts of the world. Exports from China to other Asian economies or to Europe have increased significantly. Imports from the US side from Europe or from other Asian economies have also increased. So the trade matrix is changing. It's adapting to these tensions. And so far it's not really declining, but it's become more complicated. It's a much more complex picture.
The report's theoretical framework analyzes the complex development of 2025. First, it addresses the paradox of initial resilience followed by warning signs. Apparent strength in early 2025 was driven by temporary front-loading of consumption and investment by firms and households, anticipating higher tariffs. This behavior, along with trade flow diversion to third countries, is now unwinding. A key factor is the US dollar's behavior. Contrary to historical precedent, the dollar did not appreciate in response to the 2025 tariffs. As shown in Figure 1.8, the dollar weakened markedly in April and May. This absence of an exchange rate offset amplifies the inflationary impact of tariffs for US importers. Second, the report details slowing activity visible beneath headlines distortions. US GDP contracted at minus 0.6% annualized rate in Q1 2025, followed by a 3.8% rebound in Q2. Figure 1.3 shows this volatility was driven by massive swings in imports and inventories, not underlying demand. The US labor market also deteriorated, with unemployment ending up at 4.3% in August. In China, growth slowed from 6.1% in Q1 to 4.2% in Q2 as the contribution from net exports receded. The euro area and Japan also saw export performance weaken. Third, the report models the impact of uncertainty. The real options mechanism, established by Bernanke 1983, causes firms to defer irreversible projects when the outlook is clouded. This compounded by a precautionary behavior channel where increased income risk, noted by Bansal and Yaron 2004, prompt households to raise savings and soften consumption. Figure 1.5 illustrates this model. A tariff uncertainty shock creates a temporary boost from front-loading, but then acts as a negative demand shock, causing activity to soften. Fourth, the report analyzes inflation dynamics. Tariff pass-through consumer prices has been muted and delayed. Figure 1.7 shows that while the actual tariff rate paid at customs has lagged the effective tariff rate, very little of the expected cost has passed to consumers in categories like food and clothing. This is partly due to firms absorbing costs into high profit margins. However, Figure 1.6 reveals a divergence. Core goods inflation is visibly climbing in the United States. Unlike in other economies, the lack of a strengthening dollar, which would normally offset tariff costs, means US firms and households are bearing the burden. Figure 1.8 also shows that Japanese auto exporters, for example, have cut prices on US-bound cars by over 20%, absorbing the tariff, while prices to the rest of the world remain stable. Finally, the report assesses the policy mix. Fiscal policy remains too loose in many large economies. Figure 1.9 shows that projected 2025 primary deficits in the US, France, and China remain sizably larger than pre-pandemic averages. This raises debt sustainability concerns, as higher real long-term interest rate, also shown in Figure 1.9, complicate the post-pandemic debt calculus. This loose financial stance has forced monetary policy stance to diverge, with the US facing persistent inflation, while other central banks have more room to maneuver. The report's analysis of the outlook projects subdued global growth. First, the dim prospects. As shown in the table 1.1, global growth is projected to slow from 3.3% in 2024 to 3.2% in 2025 and 3.1% in 2026. A significant divergence persists. Advanced economies are forecast to grow only 1.6% in 2025, while emerging markets are projected at 4.2%. Figure 1.11 provides a regional breakdown. The United States is projected at 2% growth in 2025. The euro area is forecast at 1.2%. China is projected to decelerate to 4.8% in 2025 and 4.2% in 2026, while India remains resilient at 6.6%. Global inflation is expected to decline to 4.2% in 2025, but in the US, it is projected at 2.7%, remaining above the 2% target. Second, this forecast rests on specific global assumptions. Detailed in Figure 1.10, commodity prices projections shows oil price averaging $68.92 per barrel in 2025. Monetary policy projections assume US 10-year bond yields will average 4.3%. Fiscal policy assumptions show advanced economies maintaining a broadly similar stance, while emerging markets are projected to tighten modestly. Third, the report analyzes evolving external balances. Figure 1.13 shows the US current account deficit widened to 4.6% of GDP in the first half of 2025. In contrast, China's surplus expanded to 3.2% and Japan's to 4.7%. This has driven a deterioration in the US net international investment position, or NIIP, while the euro area and Japan continue to accumulate net foreign assets. Figure 1.14 projects these imbalances will persist. Fourth, the medium-term outlook remains weak. Figure 1.15 shows global growth projected to average only 3.2% from 2027 to 2030, below the pre-pandemic average. This reflects structural headwinds, including population aging in advanced economies and slowing convergence in China. The World Trade Outlook, shown in Figure 1.12, is also subdued. Trade volume growth is forecast at only 2.3% in 2026, well below historical averages, reflecting a drag from trade fragmentation. This factoring of the global economic network, as analyzed by researchers like Lenzen 2002 and in network theory, reduces efficiency and impedes growth. Finally, the report highlights two specific headwinds for developing countries. Figure 1.16 shows that official development assistance, or ODA, dropped 9% in 2024 and is expected to fall similarly in 2025. Concurrently, Figure 1.17 notes that restrictive immigration policies in advanced economies are projected to reduce net migration, impacting remittance flows to developing nations. The baseline projection is weak and risk remained tilted heavily to the downside. First, persistent trade policy uncertainty, visible in Figure 1.2, continues to suppress business investment via the real option mechanism. Second, the report identifies parallels between the current AI investment boom and the dot-com bubble. Valuations have soared on expectations of transformative productivity gains. Box 1.2 quantifies this risk, showing a significant probability of a market correction. If these gains materialize, a severe repricing could be triggered. Third, China faces structural vulnerabilities. The property sector continues to contract and the economy faces debt deflation risk, with producer and consumer price inflation near zero. The report finds China's industrial policy, detailed in Box 3.1, has supported specific sectors but has lowered aggregate total factor productivity by an estimated 1.2% due to misallocation. Fourth, fiscal vulnerabilities are high. Figure 1.9 shows primary deficits in major economies remaining well above pre-pandemic levels, while real long-term interest rates are rising. This combination, along with large refinancing needs, constrains fiscal space. Fifth, the report warns against political pressure on central bank independence, which is critical for anchoring inflation expectations. To counter this risk, the report outlines three policy priorities. First, policymakers must establish clear, transparent, and rule-based trade policy roadmaps to reduce uncertainty. The report estimates that a material reduction in trade uncertainty could rise global output by 0.4%, with an additional 0.3% gain from lowering tariffs. Second, governments must rebuild fiscal buffers through credible medium-term consolidation, combining spending rationalization with revenue generation. Third, central banks must preserve their independence to calibrate monetary policy appropriately, balancing price stability and growth risks.
So let me rotate to resilience. Despite the sweeping policy shifts we have seen this year and defining many expert predictions, the global economy has held reasonably well thus far. World growth is projected to slow from 3.3% last year to 3.2% in 2025 and 3.1% next year. Slower than needed and below what we forecast 1 year ago, but not a dramatic slowdown. One reason for this resilience has been something that Ajay advocates for all the time: private sector adaptability.
Chapter 2, Emerging Market Resilience, Good Luck or Good Policies, investigates the source of recent emerging market stability. Historically, EMs were highly vulnerable to global risk-off period. The report identifies 16 such episodes since 1997, as shown in Figure 2.2. A comparison of these events reveals a structural shift. Figure 2.3, Effects of Risk-off Shocks, demonstrates that in the post-global financial crisis period, EMs experiences significantly smaller output losses and negligible inflationary pressures compared to the pre-GFC era. This chapter quantifies the drivers of this resilience. It tests two hypotheses: good luck, referring to favorable external conditions, versus good policies, referring to improved domestic macroeconomic frameworks. Figure 2.1 illustrates these two potential drivers, tracking the evolution of external conditions against the adoption of stronger fiscal and monetary policy frameworks over time. The analysis seeks to determine the relative contribution of each.
Quickly, we're trying to deliver macro stability, financial stability, economic stability for the benefit of all the people. If we're going to do that successfully, we need to do it in a completely non-political way, which means we don't take sides, we don't play one side against the other, we stay out of issues that are really not our bailiwick, and we just focus on those things. Really, we're trying to have it be so that the public lives their best economic lives, and so elected policymakers can make the really important decisions in a stable environment. And so that's how I think about it.
Ethical framework in Chapter 2 first defines the problem and then analyzes the evolution of the policy frameworks that address it. First, to measure resilience, the report identifies 16 distinct risk-off episodes since 1997, shown in Figure 2.2, including the dot-com crash, the global financial crisis, and the COVID-19 pandemic. The magnitude and duration of these shocks have remained broadly comparable over time. However, the economic impact on EMs has fundamentally changed. Figure 2.3, Effects of Risk-Off Shocks, shows that pre-GFC, this shock caused an average output loss of 1.8% and a 0.9% price increase. Post-GFC, the output loss was significantly smaller and the inflationary impact became negligible. Second, the report analyzes the evolution of the policy frameworks driving this resilience. Monetary policy frameworks have improved. Figure 2.4 shows that post-GFC, EM central banks significantly reduced their policy response to exchange rate pressures, mitigating the fear of floating. The response to inflation gaps also declined, reflecting improved credibility as inflation expectations become anchored. Smaller rate adjustments are required. Figure 2.4 also quantifies this, showing the sensitivity of long-term inflation expectation to short-term surprises has collapsed since the pre-crisis era. This improved credibility is supported by institutional reforms, as Figure 2.5 shows that both de jure central bank independence and de facto autonomy in EMs improved significantly post-GFC. Foreign exchange intervention practices has also evolved. Figure 2.6 shows that EMs with well-anchored inflation expectations now intervene less in response to uncovered interest party UIP deviations, allowing flexible exchange rates to absorb shocks. Fiscal frameworks have strengthened. Figure 2.7 shows the strength of fiscal rules in EMs has increased substantially. This has improved policy conduct. Figure 2.8 demonstrates a marked shift from pro-cyclical government spending pre-GFC to more counter-cyclical spending post-GFC. Furthermore, Figure 2.9 shows fiscal policy has become more responsive to debt sustainability, with EMs shifting toward more stable fiscal positions. Finally, the report integrates these findings in Figure 2.10. It quantifies their contribution to resilience during risk-off episodes, finding that good policies raised post-GFC growth by 0.5 percentage points. Monetary, macroprudential, and fiscal improvements each contributed roughly one-third of this gain. For inflation, monetary policy improvements were the dominant factors, accounting for 0.6 percentage point of the lower inflation observed post-GFC. The report's analysis in Chapter 2 empirically tests the good luck versus good policy hypothesis. First, it quantifies the contribution of policy frameworks to macroeconomics stabilization. The analysis used a two-stage approach, examining 16 risk-off episodes since 1997. The findings shown in Figure 2.10, Panel 1, are economically significant during an identical risk-off shock. An emerging market at the 75th percentile of inflation anchoring qualities experiences 1.3 percentage point less inflation than an economy at the 25th percentile. Similarly, better FX mismatch management is associated with 1.3 percentage point higher growth. Figure 2.10, Panel 2, decomposes the sources of this resilience. Compared to the pre-GFC period, improved policy frameworks contributes 0.5 percentage point to higher growth during post-GFC risk-off shocks. This gain was split equally between monetary, macroprudential, and fiscal improvements. In contrast, these frameworks lowered inflation by 0.6 percentage points, gain primarily attributable to monetary policy improvements and better anchored expectations. Favorable external conditions also contributed 0.5 percentage points to growth, but had a negligible impact on inflation. Second, the report uses a quantitative integrated policy framework QIPF model to assess how to deal with future shocks. The model incorporates four key frictions: FX risk premiums, sudden stop risks, weak inflation anchoring, and balance sheet mismatches. Figure 2.11 models the policy trade-offs. In response to an identical 10% depreciation shock, an EM with strong policy framework post-GFC calibration can avoid aggressive tightening as inflation expectation remain anchored. The output contraction is mild. In an EM with weak frameworks pre-GFC calibration, the same shock causes inflation expectation to de-anchor, forcing the central bank into a costly trade-off between a deep recession or a severe inflation spiral. This difference in anchoring directly impacts financial stability. Figure 2.12 shows that for an identical shock, the probability of a sudden stop or abrupt capital flow reversal is significantly higher in the weak framework economy. The model also quantifies policy mistakes. Figure 2.13 shows the cost of delaying monetary tightening in a weak framework economy. Delaying rate hikes does not avoid output losses. It amplifies them later as inflation expectation de-anchor. Finally, Figure 2.14 analyzes the effect of foreign exchange interventions. Interventions can be effective in the acute phases of a shock to reduce market volatility. However, sustained interventions that resist fundamental exchange rate adjustment are costly, deplete reserves, and can dangerously delay necessary monetary policy tightening, particularly in weak framework economies. Chapter 2 concludes that emerging market resilience is primarily a result of deliberate policy improvements, a finding that carries significant implication. The report identifies best practices across three dimensions. First, credible monetary policy frameworks that anchored inflation expectations supported by the central bank independence detailed in Figure 2.5. Second, macroprudential frameworks that reduced balance sheet vulnerabilities. Third, fiscal frameworks that enforced counter-cyclical discipline. The report highlights the role of IMF precautionary arrangements. Box 2.1 provides evidence that these arrangements help reduce the probability and severity of sudden stop during risk-off episodes, acting as a commitment device that lowered refinancing costs. The importance of these frameworks is reinforced by analyzing policy failures. As documented in Box 2.3, undermining central bank independence leads to de-anchored inflation expectation, currency depreciation, and ultimately higher output costs to restore stability. The report warns that these resilience gains are not permanent and identifies three key vulnerabilities: the potential deterioration of external conditions, compressed fiscal space due to high public debt, and the acute risk of policy backsliding, particularly the erosion of central bank independence.
We're dealing with an economy in China where credit money is allocated by the state and not by the market. And the state picks sectors that they want to promote. And in that kind of economy, if you do that, you always get overinvestment, you always get overcapacity, you always get overproduction. And then that overproduction gets dumped on the rest of the world.
Chapter 3 analyzes the global resurgence of industrial policy, defined as government intervention targeting specific firms or sectors to reshape the domestic economy. After decades of market liberalization, this consensus has fractured. Figure 3.1, Panel 1 documents this trend, showing a significant increase in new industrial policy interventions since 2009, with a sharp acceleration after 2020 in both advanced and emerging economies. The motivations are multifaceted, as shown in Figure 3.3, Panel 1. Strategic competitiveness is the most cited driver, followed by climate mitigation and GVC resilience. These motivations are linked to tangible security concerns. Figure 3.4, Panel 1 shows the high fossil fuel import dependence of many economies, particularly the EU and Japan. This has spurred industrial policies for energy security. Simultaneously, the energy transition detailed in Figure 3.4, Panel 2 shows electricity rising share of final energy consumption, driving demand for clean technologies. The sectors targeted reflect these priorities. Figure 3.3, Panel 2 shows that high technology manufacturing is the most targeted sector globally, followed by commodities, energy, and food.
And at the same time, the government identify a number of sectors as a strategic sector. So they give lots of subsidies and encouragement, including political encouragement for local leaders, whoever can develop a particular sector. So that creates extra incentives for companies to rush in to some very narrow sectors to put their resources to in that part. So therefore that you can say this competition is not based on open market, but this kind of competition is very much organized, at least is induced by particular administrative structure.
Chapter 3 analyzes the theoretical framework behind the global return to industrial policy. First, it documents the trend. Figure 3.1, Panel 1 shows a surge in new industrial policy interventions since 2009, accelerating after 2020. Figure 3.3, Panel 1 details the instruments used. Subsidy-based measures, including direct support and subsidized financing, count for over 80% of interventions in both advanced and emerging economies. These interventions carry significant fiscal burdens, as shown in Figure 3.2, Panel 2. Estimated fiscal costs are substantial, reaching 4.5% of GDP in China in 2021, and ranging from 1 to 2.5% of GDP in several advanced economies. Sectoral targeting reflects strategic motivations. Figure 3.3, Panel 2 shows that high technology manufacturing is the most targeted sector. The energy sector is also primary focus, as shown in Figure 3.1, Panel 2, with 1/3 of all policies since 2009 targeting at least one energy product. This is driven by the high fossil fuel import dependence seen in figure 3.4. Second, the report models the infant industry theory used to justify these policies. The premise is that government support can help a new domestic industry overcome initial high cost by accelerating learning by doing. However, the report models the significant trade-offs involved. Figure 3.5 illustrates that while IP can boost domestic production, it does so at the cost of temporarily higher consumer price during the catch-up phase. The success of such a policy is highly sensitive to initial conditions. Figure 3.6 models how the long-term effects of IP depend on key sectoral characteristics. The policy is less likely to succeed if the country starts too far from the global technology frontier, if the domestic learning rate is slow, or if the domestic market size is too small to allow firms to achieve economies of scale. Report's analysis of industrial policy effectiveness relies on historical case studies and modern empirical data. First, the report contrasts key historical policies. Korea's export-oriented strategy in the 1970s, which emphasizes learning by doing and global market access, is considered a success. Brazil's concurrent import substitution policy, implemented through state-owned enterprises, had a mixed record. The report also analyzes contemporary EU industrial policy for electronic vehicles, or EVs. Figure 3.7 decomposes the recent EV price decline, finding it was driven by technology, economies of scale, and policy support. Figure 3.8 and 3.9 illustrate the central trade-off: reshoring policies, domestic manufacturing support, achieve self-reliance, but result in higher consumer prices and slower adoption than policies that simply promote access to the cheapest global technologies. Second, the report analyzes the sector-level performance of industrial policies implemented from 2009 to 2022. Figure 3.10 shows that on average, industrial policies are associated with only modest sectoral improvements. One additional direct support measures is linked to just 0.5% higher value added 3 years later. Crucially, results diverge by income level. In advanced economies, direct support is associated with positive effect on value added, productivity, and allocative efficiency. In emerging markets, subsidized financing is associated with 0.5% reduction in allocate efficiency, suggesting capital may be misdirected to less productive firms. Results also vary by sector type. Figure 3.10 shows subsidized financing is associated with 0.5% value-added increase in infant industries, but a 1.2% decline in major industries, suggesting it is only effective when alleviating capital constraints for young, high-potential firms. Third, the report analyzes cross-sector spillovers and aggregate effect. Industrial policy in one sector, like energy, can have downstream impacts. Figure 3.11 shows that directed support to energy sectors is linked to 0.7% higher value added in downstream sectors. However, Figure 3.12 shows these sectoral gains come at the cost of drawing resources away from untargeted sectors, muting the aggregate effects. These highlight the risk of misallocation. Figure 3.13 models this, showing that optimal industrial policy targeted at high potential sectors can raise aggregate TFP, but a uniform for poorly targeted subsidy, despite having the same fiscal cost, can reduce it. Box 3.1 provides a case study of industrial policy in China is estimated to have reduced aggregate TFP by 1.2% and GDP by up to 2%, as support for targeted sectors crowded out more productive activities elsewhere. Chapter 3 concludes that industrial policy effectiveness is highly conditional. Success requires specific conditions such as genuine learning by doing externalities and access to large, often global markets. Figure 3.10 shows that policy effectiveness varies. Subsidized financing is associated with 0.5% value-added increase in infant industry, but a 1.2% decline in major industries. Furthermore, strong institutions are essential. The report finds direct support policies are associated with positive allocative efficiency in advanced economies, but not in emerging markets. The report emphasizes that these policies involve significant trade-offs. As modeled in Figure 3.9, reshoring policies achieve domestic production at the cost of higher consumer prices and slower technology adoption. The fiscal opportunity costs are also substantial, estimated in Figure 3.2 at up to 4.5% in GDP in China. A critical finding concerns aggregate effects. Sector-level gains often mask economy-wide misallocation. As shown in box 3.1, China's industrial policies are estimated to have reduced aggregate total factor productivity by 1.2% by diverting resources from more productive, untargeted sectors. Figure 3.13 models this, showing that poorly targeted uniform subsidies can reduce aggregate TFP, even with large fiscal outlays. The report concludes with policy recommendations. Governments must manage trade-offs and be aware of high opportunity costs. If industrial policy is pursued, it must be well targeted at diagnosed market failures and embedded in strong institutional and macroeconomic frameworks. And finally, the report suggests a preference of horizontal policies as detailed in box 3.3. Structural reforms, such as improving the general business environment, governance, and education, often yield better, more broad-based outcomes with lower fiscal costs and distortion risks than targeted sectoral interventions. Central finding is that resilience is not a product of external good luck, but of internal good policies. In this fragmented landscape, stability is not something a country passively receives. It is something it must actively build. The IMF's data-driven conclusion thus echoes a timeless call for domestic responsibility.
When I'm back on top,
hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
spinning around. I've been a puppet, a pauper, a pirate, a poet, a pawn and a king. I've been up and down and over and out. And I know one thing, each time I find myself flat on my face. I pick myself up and get back in the race. That's life.
That's life.
I tell you, I can't deny it. I thought of quitting, baby, but my heart just ain't gonna buy it. And if I didn't think it was worth one single try, I'd jump right on a big bird and then I'd fly. I've been a puppet, a pauper, a pirate, a poet, a pawn and a king. I've been up and down and over and out, and I know one thing. Each time I find myself laying flat on my face, I just pick myself up and get back in the race. That's life.
That's life.
That's life. And I can't deny it. Many times I thought of cutting out, but my heart won't buy it. But if there's nothing shaking come this here July, I'm gonna roll myself up in a big ball and